The reason we're sitting here today is because of Chris. And I think his legacy clearly lives on. Jimmy is going to talk a little bit about Chris in a minute, but I just wanted to acknowledge a few things about Chris, some of which you may or may not know. A remarkable man, we all know that, and there have been some phenomenal obituaries written in some very high-profile areas, and I would recommend you kind of read them because it really does reflect what a fantastic career he has. As many of you know, Chris pioneered a number of areas. He's extremely well known as in the field of obstetric medicine, setting up the Silver Star unit, focusing on preeclampsia, and of course, the founder with Isabel Walker of this charity. You may not know that one of the reasons Chris was well known for his fetal monitoring, the very famous Dawes Redman criteria, is simply because when he did his initial studies treating women with antihypertensives, he was frustrated and sort of wanted to know, well, why was the baby still dying? And to this day, this is something that we still struggle with. You know, treating blood pressure does not necessarily reduce risks directly to the baby, and something we should be cognizant of as we push forward with therapies related to maternal therapy, the maternal sort of phenotype. And that was why he said, well, I want to do something to try and check out the baby in this devastating condition. I think one thing about Chris, I won't go through all the many achievements, because I think one, we're very familiar with them. I'm sure Jimmy will allude to a lot of these, but unlike many people, Chris was such a people person while high achieving in the academic world, and that is an unusual feature. It's such a nice guy. I never worked directly with him, but he was great friends with my mentor, Michael DeSweet. And whenever I met him, he was always so gracious, so facilitative, so supporting, and remained so throughout my career. And I think that's a real reflection on him being supportive of everyone. And it's clearly, from all the things we've heard about him, a hugely popular guy in all fields and a phenomenal family man. So I just wanted to kind of acknowledge that side of him, just a really nice guy who is sorely missed. And I'll finish off with one simple anecdote. I was giving one of my team was giving a lecture yesterday, and she said to me, oh, there's this great slide of yours, Andy, that I want to use in my talk. And of course, she picked out the one slide that Chris had made and had given to me to use. And I thought that was very fitting for today. Like, his legacy lives on. So even yesterday in a talk where I am in Sierra Leone, we are showing his work and his slides. And that I think is kind of reflection of what a phenomenal impact he has had. I'm in Sierra Leone simply because it's the worst place in the world for preeclampsia outcomes. I'll apologize in advance if the Wi-Fi comes and goes a little bit, but we are all here continuing his work, and I think that's fantastic. Jimmy, would you like to take over?
Thank you. I seem to have messed up my video, but I'll get that back in a minute. Thank you, Andy. I'm really sorry. I'm too hard here. And if you could keep talking just for a few more minutes, and I'll interrupt as soon as I've got this up and running again. I've lost the screen.
Yeah, so I'll just keep talking. So one of the things that I hadn't appreciated was Chris just had such diversity. He was a phenomenal scientist. and you know, he went into basic science. He really was someone who engaged with women, and his Silver Star service, as we all know, his interactions with people like Isabel Walker meant that his impact was across the entire spectrum of basic science through to, you know, the user end of it. And I think that that breadth of impact in the pre-eclampsia world can't be understated. So it can't be overstated. So I think that's something to just recognize. It's something that I personally have strive to kind of do, and I do think his legacy is going to live for a very long time. Are you on, Jimmy? Do you want to?
Yep, I'm back on now. Thank you very much.
Fantastic.
Yeah, I want to, Andy sort of touched on all the different things. And one of the interesting things about Chris is that different people who have come across him in different ways will remember him for different reasons. And it's trying to, always very difficult in these situations to try and see what the overall whole of the person was. So there'll be people in the audience today who know far more about Chris, about specific areas that he's worked in than I have, but I've known him for over 40 years. So I want to sort of go through and just talk about him as a doctor, a scientist, a collaborator, and an advocate and a person. So Chris is interesting. He started in Cambridge. That's where he got his university degree in natural sciences, and then moved to medicine. And then he intended initially to become a pediatrician. But as always interesting in looking back in people's careers, it was certain serendipity that got him into preeclampsia, because he joined the Regius Professor's Medicine's Professor Wetherell's department in Oxford in 1970, and he was given a project to do and look at women with high blood pressure in pregnancy. He'd never had that interest before, particularly, but he was asked to then look at that and investigate that, and that's what he did. Now, this was one of the first times that you had physicians going into an obstetric unit. And you can imagine at that time, and those who can remember back to into the 1970s and 80s, that you remember that obstetricians weren't necessarily welcoming of physicians into maternity units. And Chris, and a lot of his frustrations, and Andy's described, was about frustrations about how poorly obstetricians managed medical problems within pregnancy. But in the 1970s, he published 3 particular papers which interest me a great deal as a young researcher coming through in Glasgow. The first one was his paper on methyl-dopa and the treatment of women with hypertension in pregnancy to control the blood pressure and the side effects, and to see whether you can prevent women with essential hypertension becoming preeclamptic. And one of the things he had to do then was find things which could diagnose preeclampsia over and above blood pressure. Because up to that time, people thought that blood pressure was the main factor, not anything else. And he showed that you had early platelet consumption, and you showed you had rises of uric acid. And he was one of the first people to show that there was a systemic disease here in preeclampsia, and it wasn't just blood pressure alone. And these things were stimulating. They allowed people to think about this condition of preeclampsia slightly more than just than preeclampsia itself, just high blood pressure itself. He also noted very bad outcomes in early onset disease. And at that time, early onset disease was less than 34 weeks, and where the babies tend to die because either they died in utero, because no one could really diagnose the problem of fetal distress, or they died after delivery because of prematurity. And to look after women who had this condition and had previous episodes of preeclampsia, he set up the Silver Star unit in Oxford. And this the Silver Star because they had a Silver Star on their case records. And he then specialized in looking after people with this problem. And again, this conflicted a lot with the obstetric thinking at the time in Oxford, who a lot of obstetricians objected to a physician coming in and telling them what to do with their patient. But he was really one of the first people to provide specialized care from a dedicated clinician and through his Silver Star team. And this was the start, following on from Michael de Sweet's work in London. It's the start of really a subspecialization of maternal medicine. And this is a model which then has developed with people like Catherine Nelson-Piercy in London and others, to now we're now developing maternal medicine throughout the country with consultants throughout the country, and also throughout the world. So he very much was a pioneer in the way of thinking, of concentrating on a particular area and specializing in that. And it was very well known. This is a picture of him with Princess Di, showing him around the Silver Star unit in 1986. And because it was a very well known in the area for looking after women who came from far and wide, who had previous pre-eclampsia, who wanted to have the specialist care that he provided that wasn't available from elsewhere. Now, the other thing, at the same time, he was a scientist, and he wanted to investigate what was going on in pre-eclampsia. And he worked for a long time with Ian Sargent, the scientist within the unit, and they looked at and showed that immunity and maternal cell-mediated immunity was in normal and pre-eclamptic pregnancy, to show that there was an inflammation in pre-eclampsia, which was maybe an underlying factor in the condition. Whether it was the cause or whether it was the effect or whether it was the sign of why women became pre-eclamptic and endothelial dysfunction or not, we didn't really know, but there was an evidence of inflammation occurring in these women. He then went on and looked at what a lot of us who were working along the same area used to talk about placental debris of trophoblast deportation in pre-eclampsia and what effect that has on the vascular endothelium. And this is the start of the whole concept of the two-stage model of the placental problem causing placental stress or maybe hypoxia, and then the systemic effect of trophoblast transportation in the vesicles, and that stimulated and affected the vascular endothelium. And this is Chris presenting this data, talking about, it's a bit blurred, but talking about the symptomatological stress with something then being released, causing vascular endothelial dysfunction, and this two-stage effect that it has. Now, this was a start of a whole new concept of thinking about preeclampsia, and started people like Jim Roberts in the States, who looked at vascular endothelial dysfunction, Phil Baker, who worked with Jim Roberts at that time, published some of that work. And so it became a group of people around the world, and I'll come back to that, his collaboration, who then looked at this condition in a completely different way because of the pioneering ideas and thoughts that Chris and his fellow researchers in Oxford had. As Andy pointed out, that when he was looking after these preeclamptic women, he got very frustrated that you couldn't really monitor the babies very well. And the CTGs that were done, the obstetricians really were not very sure about them and didn't really assess them very well. So he realized he had to do something about this, not because he wanted to solve all the problems in the world, but he wanted something that could assess antenatally the baby. And he joined up with Professor Geoffrey Dawes in Oxford, who developed the Dawes-Redman system, which is really one of the first sort of artificial intelligence type approaches to assessment of fetal monitoring, and is now widely established today. And it was first marketed in 1991 and the World Reader, so in this area. So it's another example of him going to great lengths to do something different that we as obstetricians had sat and looked at for a number of years, and the CTGs have been being looked at since the early 70s. But he come in to do something which was quite revolutionizing and change things. I talked about also that he's a collaborator, and one of the things about Jim is he talked to other people, and that he was involved in the work forming the UK Society of Study Hypertension and Pregnancy, and to some extent today's meeting has come out of that sort of philosophy. But he was also involved in the International Society of Hypertension and Pregnancy, an organization that only started in 1976, so very much when Chris was starting out on his career. He linked up with Jim Roberts, a well-known researcher in the States, initially in California, then in Pittsburgh, and he formed Talks, which was a group of people that came together in the hills overlooking San Francisco every 2 years to talk about preeclampsia, and having different people with new ideas coming to present and discuss things, to talk about where we can go with this condition and how we can improve it. Pierre V. Rabelais, who is a French obstetrician who worked in La Réunion in the middle of the Southern Atlantic, set up meetings every 2 years and alternated talks. And again, people from all over the world came to that. And more recently, setting up CoLab, which is a group of researchers around the world looking at common themes and common developments. And there's people in this audience who have far more experience of CoLab than I do. But Chris was a mainstay through all of this and helped to link people together. He would be happily to go and talk about his interests. And this is in Germany. You can see the back was a piano, and he didn't necessarily use music in all these presentations, but he may have done on this one. But he was someone who wanted to present and talk and communicate and listen to other people and to help to spread it. So the important thing at that time was that the Isabel Walker and Andy Etchells, who were patients of his through the Silver Star team, were asked to join the Silver Star committee shortly after the birth of their second child in '88. And this went on to then develop the action on pre-eclampsia set up in 1991 by Isabel and Professor Redman, which supported education and fundraising and why we are here today. They produced a book, and this is the second edition, but the book of understanding preeclampsia for women to read, and also for medical staff and clinicians to read. Therefore he's been a pioneer in maternal medicine, opening doors for others, co-finding action in preeclampsia. He was rewarded nationally and internationally, both from obstetric and also from maternal medicine societies for the work he's done. But lastly, just very briefly, I want to talk about him as a person. I met him first in 1982 in the International Society Pregnancy meeting in Dallas. And there was the meeting of the famous worm, which people thought was the cause of preeclampsia briefly. He was very friendly and encouraging to me as a young researcher. I was 30 at that time as a registrar, just starting off. He did think I was an anaesthetist, which may be the reason why he was friendly and not an obstetrician, but he and I got on very well over the next 40 years. I joined APEC in the mid-90s as a trustee and then become medical director when Chris stepped down. But I've worked with him in these various groups. The most important thing is he introduced me and my wife to margaritas in a Tex-Mex bar in Dallas. He's someone who worked with people very and cared for people. Isabel Walker quotes that she was going to interview him and thought he might be an arrogant, patronizing consultant as she has commonly had come across, but she found him friendly, helpful, and lovely. And once the business part of the meeting was over, she told him the story and he listened to her carefully. He loved the outdoor. And this is in Iceland. And there are people also in this audience who far more information on that than I have. And before every meeting, he tended to go for some trip somewhere, walking the hills or something interesting as an extracurricular activity. So he was a family man, latterly moved back to Oxford to be nearer to his children. He loved his children, his grandchildren. He was very, very, very much a well-rounded individual. And depending on which bit you knew, that he was charming, he was lovely, he was an extra special man. And we all now stand on the shoulders of giants. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jimmy.